Ketna, welcome to the
Anand.
show.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste. I want to actually start with a quote that you said that stuck with me. You said that paintings are nothing but frozen energy. What did you mean by that?
The context, if we see life through the philosophy of quantum physics, it means that when you look at our solidified reality through the subatomic lens, then we are all very small atoms, protons, and neutrons bobbing along. But just because our five senses are composed in a certain way, everything appears solid. So a painting is frozen chromatic energy. It represents a certain vibrational frequency that is vibrating very finely with the intention of the person, in this case me, that put the thought into the artwork. It was translated into symbols and colors, and it's remained as a frozen encapsulated story. So it's not just decoration. We're kind of trained to think of everything that doesn't engage with our senses in a verbal or an acoustic way as something that's irrelevant. But if you say a mantra in your head, for example, it has a very powerful resonance. But if you were to write it down, that resonance would take on 100 times more potency. And if you were to paint it or have it on a wall, or like you see in a lot of Tibetan monasteries or Indian temples, it takes on a few thousand-fold more strength and power. But it's just that we don't, the way we've been trained, we don't understand how this language works. And so a painting is not just a painting when you see it in that context.
It's really interesting that you use the word language, because when you were speaking there, it reminded me of something that I heard about what the power of language actually does, and what language has allowed humans to do is to actualize or put into some form of relatability what goes on in our heads, right? So there's a whole universe of different parallels that our mind can go into, but the fact that over time humans develop this thing called language means that we're now able to, at least in part, communicate that narrative of what's going on in order to allow us to connect with other people, right? Or tell our story. You talk about it in the form of art. Why is it art and paintings and that sort of creativity that you were drawn to communicate that narrative that you're looking to do?
It's a good question. I guess when I was growing up in Kenya, my everyday world, in my perception, was quite mediocre, and my parents had a few friends and we would only go to each other's houses. And even though we lived in an African country, we didn't have many African friends, even though I had African classmates. I'd never been to an African person's house for dinner. I'd never been to a white person's house for dinner. And so it was odd. It was like we were living in our own cultural zoo, and we go to Premier Club for khichdi on Sundays, or we go to some uncle's house. I think that limiting stage set gave way to a very large imagination on my side, because I've always been a bit of a daydreamer. I'm always, I read. I used to read even when I couldn't read. My parents tell me that I would have magazines upside down, and I never played with toys or dolls, or I never wore skirts apparently, and I would just be obsessed with books. So they said that I was really into stories. And I guess when your imagination is just left to its own devices, one of the ways it can manifest its unexpressed storytelling is either through literature, or in my case, it was through painting, because I just loved sketching. And I used to do all the rangolis every Diwali, and my mom and dad would say, okay, it's Diwali next month, I want you to do all the cards, and then Christmas cards. And it was just, I just remember being quite bored, and I used art as a way of getting out of that boredom. I never, ever, ever thought that it would one day become a serious vocation, but it was just something I did to express that unexpressed space inside of my head.
The point that you mentioned of growing up in Africa, so I can, of course, in part resonate with this because my parents have that same background. So that forms part of my heritage. Something that I've only probably come to understand a bit better in the last decade, where it's coming from an African Indian background, and then especially growing up in Britain, it is a very multicultural identity that I have formed about me. In your case, from birth, you would have grown up with this multicultural sense about you, whether it's consciously realized or not. And one thing they often say about people from multicultural backgrounds is that they develop more empathy and creativity, because when you're exposed to different cultures, you see differences and you almost have no choice but to empathize. With being an Indian in Africa, it means you understand Indian culture, you're naturally exposed to African culture. So in order to adapt and grow in that environment, you have to empathize with that background. Do you see how that may have played into your sense of creativity when it comes to some of the works that we see around us?
Oh, it absolutely did, because I've been asked this before and I've articulated it to myself and to whoever's asked me that I think it developed a very strong sensitivity to stories that were not being told, because my mum and dad come from relatively poor backgrounds, and they would tell us stories. Like my mother's father was a milkman, and my father didn't ever get to know his father. They were estranged, and so when you don't have money and when you don't have a father, the rest of society, especially in the Indian context, doesn't take you that seriously, and so it brings on a type of invisibility, that you exist, but people don't really see you. You become like people's blind spot. And I think that's very debilitating for your own self-image, because you can't fully take ownership over your identity. And then without realizing it, that part of your self-image develops a limp. And then you're just limping along as opposed to like walking or galloping along, So my whole thing has always been that in whatever way I can I shine the spotlight onto all the stories that haven't been told. Obviously I'm just one person, but whatever I can do to try and neutralize this. And I guess in a way I am doing it for my parents and for my own background, because my story, like I'm just an ordinary Patel girl, with ordinary parents, ordinary everything. And does that mean I don't exist because I've become invisible, because being ordinary makes you invisible? And so unless you tell a story and it's frozen in time and then hopefully potentially will outlive me, it makes me feel more visible. Not just me, but my heritage and my background. Like you and I come from the same background. How many times do we come across people who've told our story?
Yeah, I love that. And people who've seen any of my stuff through my journey, especially since lockdown, will know that that's kind of where it began, that I started collecting the stories of that background in my own family and learned more things than I expected. But one thing that I've heard you say when you've spoken before, love the way it's phrased, you called it collective cultural insecurities, and how we need to start unpacking that. What are collective cultural insecurities?
Well, most of my work comes under the larger umbrella title of identity. So when you look at the psychological ramifications of what identity means, psychologists say you have the individual identity, you have the extended identity, which is you and your children and your spouse and your immediate family. Then you have the collective identity, which is your neighborhood, your city, your country. So it just gets bigger and bigger. You just zoom out. And I think whenever a big event happens to a community en masse, individually, we've all heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So, but there is also PTSD for a collective. Like if a country goes through a war, if you were an astrologer and you were to look at the astrological chart of that country, you would consider that one event as being a big disruptor for the future destiny of that collective space.
Yeah.
You know, so it's interesting that when the Indians were expelled from Uganda in 1972, we're not just talking about a handful of Indians. There were many, many thousands. And so we all partook in a story. There was one guy called Idi Amin who got on the radio and said, all of you need to leave, right? And so we all might be different human beings. We might not have known each other, but we all became participants of that one story. And so that means that, again, through the lens of quantum physics, we're connected. Yeah. You know, before we were a little bit separate. Now it's like, bzzz, you know, you're bonding. And a lot of people came here middle-aged. They had to give up their houses, their cars, their way of life, their business, everything, and come here and start all over again. So imagine if that were to happen to us today, like boom, something happens, like, you know, the fire in Los Angeles last week. You just lose everything. It accentuates the insecurity that I think Gujaratis already have, because we left Gujarat a few decades before that via our grandparents. And the insecurity is there because most of us in Gujarat were farmers, you know, so we never know whether the crop is going to be a good crop or a bad crop. So you always, every time it rains, you think, oh my God, if it rains too much, it's going to be a disaster. If it doesn't rain, it's a disaster. So you are always living with insecurity. Then that insecurity is projected intergenerationally to the next generation, and that you become over-practical. It's like when you have money, don't just blow it, you know, buy some gold or invest it in a business, because you don't know when the next rainy day will come, and you've got to, we all know it as Indians, right? We're not very, especially that generation, they're quite frugal. And so that insecurity manifests itself in different ways. And I think that's why we have done quite well as a community. We've done quite well economically, because it was a way of mitigating that insecurity and also broadcasting to the whole world that we're not invisible. And so insecurity, it's a complex word. It doesn't always have to be seen as a negative thing. It gives rise to entrepreneurship, ambition, tenacity, risk-taking, all sorts of things. So there's a lot more, you know, from that word, but it comes from that basic, you know, you sit and you have your rotli and shak, and then you listen to your grandparents talk and your parents talk. And like when whenever I broach the subject of doing art, my parents would immediately say, but that's not going to bring in any money, you know, because they think from the practical lens. And I completely understand that, you know, because they come from that generation.
It's so interesting that you started talking about something that I didn't even initially think of when I heard you say collective cultural insecurities, but the generations that we come from, I think is so unique that we come from a culture where it's really celebrated and encouraged to be humble, right? So humility is really promoted, but also the collective self, right? So something that you're touching on, but there's a book called The Culture Map, which talks about especially a big difference between Western cultures versus a lot of the Eastern cultures, where the collective self is what's talked about. So I think you'll know better than me, but in Hindi, even the word for I is kind of like we, right? So there's hum, right? Yeah. Whereas like you can say hu, but it's you don't really hear that, right?
Hum log ye kar rahe hai. Yeah, it's like a plural.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, you know, even buried within the language and the cultural background, it's seen as quite frowned upon, or maybe unusual to talk about self. Whereas in English, you have I, me, myself,
Yeah.
right? There's loads of words
Yeah.
signaling the individual. So it's so interesting that we, from a young age, based on that generational influence, are always told to regard ourselves and our achievements and what we're doing in the context of collective. That, where you don't really talk about yourself, plus the fact that there's been 2 generations of growing up in a place that's not India, basically, and being a minority, it's almost, you just see around you that you're told to keep your head down and work hard and not build up too much of attention on you because you are a minority. Did you see that play out either in your own family and how that may have influenced the generation of, you know, East African Indians around you, where it was kind of preached to not speak up too much about yourself and keep your head down and not make too much noise?
Yeah, it wasn't even an instruction that came down. I think only now that I'm this age and I look back at my childhood, do I realize that whenever it was the weekend and Dad would say, oh, let's go and have pizza or let's go out, he would get on the phone and call all his friends or whoever was available, and we would be like 15 or 20 people would end up in a restaurant. You know, it was very, you know what the Gujarati thing is, very impromptu. Suka rocho kai nathi karta, chalo, bring your leftovers and let's get together. So there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that sort of scenario. I mean, one, it's great because I think we became very good with people. You know, there was always noise and there was always some auntie or uncle visiting and staying at the house. We always, I remember, had lots of towels because we would always have somebody in the house. So I don't remember many instances where it was just me and my dad having dinner together and just talking. In fact, I don't remember a single time. I don't remember being asked, so what happened at school today? And what did you do? And how did that make you feel? There was no inquiry on the individual front. Much, much later, I realized that prevented me from having a conversation about myself, and I became more of an observer or a voyeur. Like, I'd be great at being in a wedding or in a jamwanu and just checking out all the aunties and their saris and eavesdropping on the conversations and, you know, all of that. But if somebody asked me, so tell me about yourself, tell me what you think about that. That happened yesterday. The safari rally happened. What did you think? Nobody had ever asked me what I think. So I think that part of me remained stunted.
Having your own opinion was kind of not a promoted.
Yeah, it wasn't promoted. So it's like your body. If you don't use your muscles, after a while they atrophy. If we're not encouraged by our immediate family or friends to tell stories, it could be just random stories about what was your afternoon at the library like, or you're reading a book, tell me about the book.
Yeah.
You know, anything. It is a beautiful thing because sometimes you don't even know that you're thinking something until somebody asks you something and you catch yourself coming out with the words. And then when it's out there, you think, oh my God, wow, I didn't realize I was thinking that.
Yeah.
And so it's so important because it builds up a heightened sense of individualism, which I think, at the risk of generalizing, is something that we're a bit weak on in our community. We're great with the kakis, kakas, masas, masis, the samosas are flowing, you know, the cooking is happening and it's very warm and welcoming. But like you get lost.
Yeah. The showing face, not in a bad way, but we're very good at the externally showing face.
Yeah, showing face and just creating a nice bubble of familial warmth. You know, like, you know, you have a nice cozy feeling in your heart because you were with people. And so you don't come across a lot of depression in our community because there's hardly any loneliness because we're gregarious communities.
Yeah.
The downside is that the individualism gets compromised and our ability to tell stories gets diminished. And that plays a part because we're all going to have children. Well, I didn't have children, but, you know, as you grow up, you're going to have children. What stories are you going to tell them about where you've come from if you yourself haven't paid attention and listened to your dad's story or your grandfather's story? How are you going to pass the torch on? And we become so comfortable thinking, you know, when we're young, when we're in our 20s, we feel quite invincible that, oh, I'm going to be young forever. And anybody above the age of 50, becomes more and more invisible. It's like you're an auntie. But the older, I'm fascinated by old people. I prefer talking to older people than I do young people because they are treasure houses of stories.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm a storyteller. I'm always looking out for a story, you know?
Yeah. The culture of growing up where, again, yeah, the self and, you know, the critical thinking, having your own thoughts was more suppressed. How did you, or do you remember when you broke out of that cultural norm or that stereotype? You know, how did you develop that side of you?
It happened when I turned 14, and that was in 1982 because the military took over the government in Kenya, and there was a lot of violence, and there was no law and order for a few days, and girls were raped, and you know, it got quite messy, and I was sent to Britain. So that emergency action that my family took of sending me here, it was like diving into the deep end. You know, it was December, and I came here by myself because my parents were back in Kenya. You know, they had to make money, and my brother was still younger than me. So I came on my own, and I just had to make sense of my reality. And I ended up living with lots of people, whoever had a spare room. And so when you are a guest in somebody else's house, you're so conscious of the fact that you might be an imposition on them.
Yeah.
So you naturally go out of your way to fit in, to help out, to not be a bother. Doing that also makes you very independent because you don't want to be a bother. You don't want anybody to cook for you or look after you or give you a lift. So, you know, you end up at that young age figuring out how to use the bus and the tube. And, you know, suddenly I'd missed a term because terms start in September. And I'd missed a term and I had to catch up on the term. And I was thrown into Shakespeare and Alfred Tennyson and Charles Dickens because that's what we were studying. And so it's sink or swim. I think now I'm really glad I did that because without knowing it, I developed a gradual inner confidence because I had no choice.
One thing you mentioned there, and I'd love to get your perspective. Do you think that the younger generation or you know the future younger generations to come are more or less equipped to be able to handle the difficulties that they're facing?
Well, I hope I'm not going to upset anybody. I think we are the sandwich generation. We still remember our parents' plight. We remember a time, I mean, you're a lot younger than me, but I remember I did architecture and I did my first 2 degrees without the internet, without the computer. So it was a different world. We all say that people are so dependent on devices now that it's removed them from reality. And I think I do worry about this because I have a lot of young people in my life. And when you're too comfortable, a part of you stagnates. And I always see that through the lens of creativity, that one of the prerequisites for creativity is that you are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
When you get too cozy, it's like get up and disrupt your world, which is why traveling is so important. It's so important to get out of your everyday context and go into an uncomfortable context and eat different food and meet different people because that's how you erode prejudices. So going back to your question, we live in a first world environment. London is supposed to be one of the most glamorous cities in the world, right? So we've got it good. The electricity never goes off. I know when I'm in India and I'm shampooing my hair, often the water's just gone off or the water's gone cold because the electricity's off. In Kenya, we've all grown up with buckets because there's not enough water in the water tank. Once our house was on fire and there was only one fire engine and it was being used somewhere else, so the fire people couldn't come, you know? So that was part of our everyday growing up, and I think that makes you a lot flexible.
Yeah.
You know, if something doesn't happen according to your expectations, you just shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's life.
And you find a way.
Yeah, whereas I feel, I mean, it's inevitable, but it can be a little bit concerning if we think that life is going to continue, and suddenly one day when there is a crisis, are we, and by we I mean especially the next generation, are they psychologically and physically prepared? I can't speak for everybody, but from my perspective, I think they're in for a bit of a shock, because they haven't seen hardship.
I mean, there's so many different ways to term this. It's called the growth mindset, where you always extend, but essentially it's this term called desirable difficulty, right? Which is, it's only when you're faced with a certain level of challenge that pushes you to have to find an outcome that actually breeds that innovation and creativity in you. And you look through history, and it's only when, necessity breeds innovation, a common phrase, but it's not just limited to companies and innovation and developing the next thing that will save, whether it's agriculture or when technology came about. It is in every individual, where understandably, and I see it in my parents and their generation as well, that they've suffered hardships that were out of their control. Idi Amin, for example, and across the world, Iranian history, Cameroonian history, wherever it is, there's been moments in my parents' generation where they've gone through hardships that they didn't intend to go through. So they want to limit that for their children's generation, which is great. But at the same time, you're right that when they're not faced with having to deal with any kind of desirable difficulty, it just means, like you say, that when a significant enough challenge does come about, who knows if they have the mental and psychological resource to be able to handle it.
They have a tough time because it's a different type of challenge. There is too much information, so it can drown you. You have the encroaching artificial intelligence, which is going to turn our world upside down. So I'm not oblivious to the fact that they have their own challenges, which manifest as anxiety, depression, panic, all sorts of things, so it's issues, like each generation comes with its own problems, but existentially, whether it's a mental problem, a physical problem, an economic problem, I think what we should encourage in each other, and it's not age specific, we need to do it at all age groups, is to remain very nimble and flexible. And I think one of the strengths of our community is that we're like chameleons, because we've got to straddle 3 identities. For us, maybe for the new generation, it's 2 identities. For us, it's East African Indian, and British. And for me, it was a 4th one, because I spent 25 years in Asia. So when you straddle, you're like constantly dancing, and that keeps you nimble. And if you're just only wearing one identity, you become like a tree. You don't move, and you become quite stultified.
And even tunnel visioned, right? You only see that one way of existence. It's interesting, especially when you've grown up in a place where there isn't as many diverse cultures. And it's definitely something that I took for granted growing up in London, thinking this is just the way of life as a child. You grow up around different cultures, you realize that people have different habits to you and tendencies. But then when I started traveling abroad, I saw, I'm currently in a village or a city where they're not used to seeing any other ways of living. So if I go and ask for eggs on toast for breakfast, they don't recognize that. And then I think it's strange that they have something completely different. I always give the example of living in China, where they have congee. Right? And for me, congee, having something that savory with spices and things and rice based for breakfast didn't make any sense. But then when you think about it, there's over 1 billion people in the world where congee is normal. So who's the
you go to South India and everybody's having idli, or you have pamwa or poha in North India. Because I've spent so long in Asia, it's been drummed into me that when you wake up in the morning, it's like switching on a car that's been cold. Like we're in winter right now, so it takes a bit of time for the engine to warm up. So they say that the worst thing you can do is putting cold food in your body. And what do? We have cereal and milk. It's the worst thing. The Chinese will just go, no, and it makes sense. You start by igniting the engine, which is your stomach. You start with the hot food.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Back to that point of visioning just one type of understanding of different backgrounds. I mean, a good example is when you come from a certain place where you're not exposed to different cultures as much, something that we've been fortunate enough to be able to do. But for those who haven't, they rely on things like media, like Netflix, right? Where you see a certain cultural stereotype there and you naturally make that association that everyone from the background is like that. So, for example, if I've grown up in somewhere where there's no Indian people around, but then I watch a show where they've put a Punjabi person or a Hindu person in the taxi driver's seat, then I'm like, they're taxi drivers.
You think all Indians shake
like
their
that.
head.
Or you watch something like Narcos, and then you're like, oh, okay, so people from Central South America are all drug dealers involved in.
Those stereotypes. They become the... they become the mascots of your imagination. Yeah.
And beautifully said, mascots of imagination. Even if we look behind us onto your artwork, I see those as mascots for your imagination. So where did that journey really begin?
So when I graduated as an architect and I went to Singapore, that's where I had my first job. I realized very, very quickly that the Singaporean developers who were commissioning the architects to make buildings were asking in their brief for the buildings to look Western, European. Like, can we have Roman columns? Can we have Doric columns? Can we have a Spanish arch or whatever? And there was a complete lack of aesthetic and representational vocabulary for their own culture. And that's a complex subject because there's been so much colonization in most of Asia. So that part of representing their culture has especially in the context of modernity, where we have skyscrapers. Before, if you're just doing one house, we can have Haveli architecture, or in China, they've got these beautiful Chinese arches. But how do you now translate it if you do coming up with a building that's 50 stories high? And so how do you translate your culture onto that building? And so I started realizing very early on, that's one of the reasons why I eventually left architecture. It's that there was such a vacuum of storytelling within the Asian culture, because for whatever reason, the storytelling aspects of our culture, the Asian culture, had been completely hijacked by the Western narrative, because the predominant civilization of our lifetime is the Western civilization.
Right.
And so we've all grown up in the shadow. It's like a big oak tree. It's so big that the plant underneath it won't grow because it won't get the sunlight. And so if I want to now start telling stories about Asia, I've got to use hooks that everybody can understand. So when I come up with stories that talk about China and India, the two most immediate characters that represent those two countries are Chairman Mao and Gandhi. So I use them more as the bouncers before you enter the nightclub or before you enter the story. These are the guys. So then it gives you a framework from which to enter. Because
almost like the figurehead.
Yeah, you need some devices when you tell a story. Like, when you watch a movie, you can tell just from the opening credits and the music whether it's going to be a thriller or a comedy or a romantic, So you need to psychologically create a framework for which the audience is going to enter the story. And that's how I come up with representation. And because these stories haven't been told, I have to use a lot of symbols, color. I have gods. Each person and each color and each object is used carefully to open up a frame of reference, which hopefully will get people curious, so that it's not just India should not be just represented by an Indian woman carrying a pot, or Ganesh, or a mud hut. Like, we want to get away from stereotypes, which is why I put a lot of my art on very modern surfaces, like acrylic or perspex or metal, or I put it on furniture. I'm trying to take it away from that typical old-fashioned traditional paint on canvas.
Right.
When things become too much of a cliche, you lose the freshness in your ability to talk to people. So you've got to constantly, whenever something gets stereotypical, you've got to turn it on its head and come up with a fresh way of telling that story.
You talk about how you don't actually see yourself as the creator of, especially the stories that you're telling, but you've described yourself as the vehicle through which the stories are being sent for you to bring it to, people who view it.
Yeah.
Underlying all of that, what are those stories that you believe are trying to be told through you?
Well, it's a bit like a CCTV camera. It's always on, right? And you never look at the footage until something happens and your emergency thing goes off, and then you go back and you look at the footage. So in a way, the stories are happening all the time. It's just that I then become like the person behind this camera saying, okay, what happened between that time and that time? And I give it a frame, and I chop it off at two ends, and I call it a story. So I'm more like the director who edits reality. Reality is happening, stories are happening. But what I've done is I've just, with my eyes, I've made my eyes into a camera, and when I blink, it's almost like the shutter going down, and I've captured that story. You can go one step further and say, well, a lot of complex stories are not just made up of what is right in front of you. Like, for example, if you look at older artists like Van Gogh or Modigliani, they would paint the woman in front of them or the bunch of flowers in front of them. But we've done that. We've gone through that. We don't need to repeat that.
Right.
What we now need to do, because we live in a global world and we're all interconnected, our storytelling has to take on that complexity of globalization. So that means the references can take on more layers of complexity, because our brains, because we live in the internet age, we can handle those references. And so when we're living in such a rich world, information-wise, why stick to minimalism? Which is why I keep saying whenever I can that I'm allergic to abstraction and minimalism, because there's zillions of stories that need to be told.
Yeah, that sense of curiosity and creativity in what you've just said is mind-blowing. And again, there's something that is a message that you preach, and I fully agree with that. The way we're heading, and we've touched on the rise of technology and AI, and just generally society is really stunting or serving as a force against people's curiosity and creativity to explore things themselves, right? Because we've moved away from a knowledge-seeking generation where it's, you get the jobs because you know a lot. You work in a factory, and if you know how to improve the processes and the productivity, then you do well. Into a generation that's serves its purpose, but it's like, how well can we ask and seek? So how well can you ask ChatGPT the right question to get the answer, because you no longer need to know the answer. So it's not about knowledge, but it's about thriving through being curious. But at the same time, education systems still teach based on textbook, learn this and then get this, right? And it's designed in some way, people might disagree, to act as a force against people's curiosity.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What advice would you give to that next generation of people coming up who maybe innately have that creativity and curiosity, and making sure that they can navigate against growing into that adult phase where it keeps getting suppressed further and further down.
We need to really amplify our imagination and our curiosity, because the future is going to be made up of different building blocks that we have never witnessed in our living life. So we have to be very open, non-judgmental, because if you put too much judgment onto anything, you almost don't see it. You just blank it out. You don't even realize you're blanking it out. It's so important to have a bigger conversation with your inner self, because I think that the distance between here and the inside of your heart, they say this in the spiritual context, is longer than from here to Jupiter.
Right.
You know? And we just think, oh, it's just a couple of inches in. But if you look at, again, quantum physics and the way fractals work, the more you go in, the more you're going out, and there is no linearity to that physical space. And we all know that we only use 5% of our brain. If you think of yourself as a biological computer, we all have to upgrade our computers, because the latest operating system won't work with an old Mac or an old PC. So if we don't regularly upgrade our operating system, then the apps stop working, right? So consciousness is the operating system for our human technology. And because the world is changing so fast, we need to upgrade our consciousness so that our biological computing speed and whatever else you want to call it can take in this information. Otherwise, it'll overwhelm us and we'll blow a fuse.
No doubt there's someone listening to this thinking, oh, it's time I upgraded my laptop. But more importantly, exactly what you're touching on, I think it's such a key point. But if we boil it down to practically, what would you say? What are the 2, 3, or maybe 5 things that people can do in their day-to-day lives to ensure that they're ready and prepared for what you're saying is coming?
Spend more time in nature, spend more time being quiet, spend more time away from devices, develop the neural network within your imagination, because there is something quite debilitating about using devices. It provides shortcuts in your neural networks which prevent you from using the long routes. So it's a bit like a motorway. The motorway will get you faster from here to Oxford, but the scenic route is the A roads and the B roads, right? So we've got to go on the scenic routes inside ourselves and not just go the fast version. Because in the scenic routes is where the stories are, where our memories are, where our imagination is, where our creativity is. And creativity is not just about making a picture or coming up with a song. Creativity is literally the power to work yourself out of problems, to whether it's in science or engineering or mathematics or accountancy. Your brain is not a separate thing. Your brain is connected to your heart and your body and your soul. So holistically, you've got to become a lot more magnified so that you're a more powerful being. So spend more time with your imagination, read more, talk to people more, be curious, travel more, do things that you haven't done before so that you're not using the same network. It's like a garden. You have to keep trimming it, you have to keep looking after it, but you've got to go to all the parts of your garden to make sure that things are not out of control.
Yeah.
So you've got to freshen up the whole of your inside, not just that lazy side which is just become TikTok-fied.
Yeah, and it's interesting, just when you were talking about the gardening example and you think about maintaining the garden, if you maintain some bits of it really well, but then you let another bit be completely ignored, it can develop weeds, and weeds can spread to the other areas, right? So, I mean, it's easier said than done. I get it, people are balancing multiple pillars, we all are, and it's hard to say that you're optimizing all of them, but you're right, by ignoring some areas of it, how you do anything is how you do everything.
Yes, you're right. And one of the lovely things about being Indian is that they constantly tell us in our scriptures that look at the whole world and yourself as a holistic entity.
Right.
In the West, we've been trained to specialize. If we can become more holistic in the way we engage with the world, like, look at somebody like Elon Musk. He's one of the greatest minds there is. Yet, I don't know when he gets the time to go on X and write what he does. He's quite involved in politics. He's now set up that Doge thing.
Yeah.
He's everywhere. And so forget about I think the future is going to be less about being specialized. It's going to be about understanding the whole equation and then adjusting the variable as opposed to only focusing on the variable.
We've spoken a lot about what individuals, especially those that, they'll be listening in and they know they have their creative edge. They've seen your work and they think, I don't even know where I'd begin with that. And you've given those practical examples. But a lot of it also comes down to, some people will naturally think that as much as I want to do something more creative, or I want to explore a passion that I have that's not just everything that you've said about sitting in your lane, but they feel it's out of their control because whether it's the society they're in, the familial background they've come from, the expectations of friends and family. How do you think that societies and communities and certain groups that people are involved in need to shift to better support, artists and people who are trying to be creative and express themselves in, whatever form they want to communicate?
I think, we can use this place as an example, right? This is the Heath Robinson Museum where this exhibition is in a part of London which a lot of people are not familiar with. And in our lexicon, whenever we think of London, we think of Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus and all the jazzy parts. And then when you tell somebody you live in Stanmore or Harrow, they just roll their eyes thinking it's irrelevant. So what I would start by saying is that think of everything as a metaphor. If you live in Harrow, but a part of you thinks that Harrow is irrelevant, then you are rendering yourself and your own story as relevant. So make your own story relevant by participating in local community. So when I moved back after 25 years in Asia, when I've moved back to the same house that I grew up in Stanmore, I really didn't know anybody. All my friends were living far away, and I was alone. I went through a divorce, and I was kind of on my own. And I just started by joining a local arts group, and it was the Harrow Open Studios. It comprises of amateurs, semi-professionals, professionals. It's a whole random group of artists. And then one thing led to another, which led to another, and I've ended up here. But I've got to thank that little group. Now, some people were telling me, why are you joining a group like that? Because that's not going to help your
growth
my growth, because, I need to be more thinking about central London and whatever. But my whole thing was, again, I'm very obsessively passionate about anything which hasn't had its story told. Like I want to get involved in that first. I don't want to tell a story about central London because it's been told a million times. I want to get involved in my story in a part of London that hasn't been told.
Right.
If you think about all the problems, you're not going to be able to take that first step. You just go with the flow, go with the intention, be open. And then before you know it, a door opens up that you had never even anticipated. And then another door opens up and another door opens up. It is literally you surrender and you go with the flow.
Yeah, you're bringing relevance to the irrelevance, which I hear this so many times where when I tell people about the podcast and the interviews and what it's kind of aiming to do, right? Speak to people with generational stories to tell and breaking cultural barriers. The number of times I hear people say that, oh, I love that. I don't have anything interesting in and it's, you never know what impact your story can have on someone through whatever perspective, in the same way that a lot of art is subjective. there's a certain objectivity, I think, with some of the characters, but it's very subjective in the same way that you may tell your story. You don't know how, like, someone could really value subjectively what they're hearing. And I think there's a certain relevance that you can bring to, metaphorically, if it's like, like the area like Harrow, but even within telling your own story, your own family story, or your own culture story, that someone can really benefit from being the recipient of that, whether it's through art or a book or, speaking on stage, whatever it may be, or just speaking to one person.
Yeah, and even the way we speak to ourselves is very important.
Yeah.
Like, I have to catch myself because my knees are not brilliant. So sometimes I say I've got bad knees. Now, in the holistic sense, that's completely the wrong thing to say, because I'm telling my knees they're bad. They're not going to get better because they're going to sit there thinking I'm bad. And so I've got to change the way I talk to myself. It's like if you meet somebody and they don't smile, and if you develop a narrative that, oh, that person is snobbish, or that person is that, or whatever, maybe they haven't got their glasses on, maybe they didn't sleep properly, and that's why they haven't smiled. It's nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
So don't impose your story upon the larger narrative and therefore close the door on that story. I think if we're just open and we just chill out, like, don't take everything seriously.
Yeah.
And I think then that's where the magic happens. You just be open, be lighthearted, be spontaneous, and don't take things too seriously. As they say in the Hindu context, this is all Maya and we're just actors on a stage. It's one day the curtains will close and everybody goes home,
To close off, there's a new section that I'm adding in, which is sponsored by these lifetime story cards. And within that, there's a series of questions that get people thinking about their own story, their legacy, the messages that they want to leave behind for others. And I've just selected a few questions from those story cards.
Okay.
These don't have to be quick fire, but they are shorter answers to give in a digestible way that someone can take something from it.
I'll try.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was there an event or decision that you took that changed the course of your life?
Yes. In my early 20s, I decided to leave London behind because I was scared that my granny was going to get me married off to a nice, sensible Patel man, and that somehow freaked me out. So I ended up going to Singapore. Nothing wrong with Patel men. It's just I wanted to explore before I become a nice goody-goody housewife,
Yeah. It's crazy that it took that moment to be that, hang on, I've got 2 ways I can go here now.
Okay.
And, I love that.
Yeah.
Were there any important traditions or cultural practices that you grew up with that you really hope will live on?
For me, in my immediate family, eating together as a family and cooking have always been there. And I think that's really helped me, because a lot of my friendships and relationships and conversations and partnerships have happened over the trust and intimacy that's created by just sharing food on a table.
Yeah.
Simple, but I would say you just can't go wrong with that. It's much better than being in a restaurant. It's just cook at home and have people over.
It's so interesting you say that. I saw a meme the other day, as many life's metaphors come about now through a meme, but it was, where they compare what was and what is now.
Yeah.
I'll get the image and put it up on the video clip as I'm saying this now, but it's in the top one. It has a family sat around the table and they're all about to say grace or say a prayer, which is, quite common that you would have seen in older movies. And then now shows that everyone is in the same position, but now they're on their phone and not even looking at each other. So rather than with their eyes closed like this, they're on their phone. And it's so, what you're saying is quite relevant, where some people might think, oh, that's an obvious thing that families do, but really, are they?
We're stopping to do it now. The older I get, I realize that the intention with which you've created the food and the intention with which everybody's come to be there and be in that moment, it's so powerful. So you're not just digesting the food, you're digesting the energy of the gathering in a loving space. And so when you go home, you might forget what you spoke about in a few days, but that package as a download into your psyche is a lot more powerful than if it was just something you grabbed in a noisy place and that you ate food that was made by some stranger.
Yeah.
If there's any way in which you can slow things down and there is direct dialogue with maximum trust in whatever context, I would say bring it on, because that's what we need.
How did you balance staying true to your roots while adapting to, your evolving art scene?
I think it just happened automatically because I lived with my grandmother for quite a long period in my adult life here in London. So the fact that I was young and going to design school, and yet my granny wanted me to do rotli and shark when I got home, was like I had to straddle both those things and keep both sides happy. And I am very attracted to mythology. And the mythology that comes with Asian culture, especially Indian culture, is there's just so much that it's like Harry Potter on steroids.
Yeah.
And so the imagination was attracted to that, as opposed to just the black and white monochromatic Western way of doing things.
Yeah.
But, our culture is more colorful. There's more layers to peel up. So the nosy person in me is more drawn to that automatically. So I didn't even have to try, it just came naturally.
What is a lesson that you've learned the hard way that you're grateful for?
That every crisis is an opportunity. I've had many, many failures, many crises. I got divorced, I've changed countries, I gave up my profession after spending so much time and energy doing design and architecture, to give it all up and start art. So the chopping and changing has been, difficult, but you go with your gut and don't worry too much about how things will pan out. Things always pan out for the better. So don't see a crisis as a closing. I just see it as an opening.
How do you want to be remembered?
As the queen of color and storytelling. And I say queen because I have a really soft spot for Diana. And somebody had asked her, how do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be remembered as a queen or something? And she said, no, I want to be queen of people's hearts. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing. That storytelling is not like it's not a physical thing. It's not like I'm going to leave this building behind or this legacy behind. But storytelling is something that is kept alive from generation to generation. But if the stories are not attractive to begin with, why would the story be kept alive? So if I can make my stories juicy, yummy, attractive, if people are drawn to it, then that's my job done,
It's like Darwinism for storytelling, survival of the fittest in the form of the stories.
Survival of the stories, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, because if we don't have our stories, who are we? We are nobody if not the story. And nobody talks about the importance of stories. People just think of that as something impractical and irrelevant. I think it's one of the most important things. When all these museums, you go to the British Museum, what is it? It is a depository of stories.
Yeah.
Right? You've got to, there's that saying, I don't know who said it, you're doomed to repeat history if you don't understand it, something like that.
Okay, yeah? Makes sense, yeah.
So in order to go forward, you've got to go backwards. And so I've always said time is not linear, it's a circle, and that you find yourself in any story that's happened in the past, but you connect to a theme in that story, and in doing that and then resurrecting the story in a contemporary sense, you're keeping the story alive. And it just makes life more fun as well,
There's a book called Same as Ever. I think it's by Morgan Housel. He says this one line, which is that history doesn't repeat itself, people do. And I think
that's brilliant.
Yeah. Going back to the point that you're making, that it's not a reoccurring pattern in history that that comes about, but rather it's that people, by the definition of being, human nature and the way they act, by not learning from the way human nature has acted in the past, are subject to make the same mistakes or even successes. So, you see the economic cycle and how it goes in peaks and troughs, and that's not a history event, right? Like a volcano erupting every century. That's by the fact that the way that human nature behaves when they're in a trough or when they're in a peak, which means that because as a population, we don't learn from the way we acted in the past peak or in the past trough, that's why economies go in the cycles. So
yeah, you've just said something very profound, that we actually create our own reality.
Yeah.
And we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes if we don't learn from our mistakes. And that's the premise of karma and reincarnation. That the whole point is that planet Earth is like a boot camp. You come here to learn about yourself. So you are deliberately given problems. Because if you don't have a problem, it's like there's no challenge. If there's no challenge, you're not going to get off your backside and do anything, right? So the challenges are built into this simulation that we're in.
Love that.
Yeah.
And finally, what is one message that you would want to leave for the future generation to live by?
Be open and be curious. Existence is not a container. It's got no walls. So be as porous as you can so that your inner world merges with the outer world, and you're like an ocean of experience. So don't think of yourself as a silo. Think of yourself as the ocean.
What a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Because we get the story and that narrative out, and then it kind of dives into like particular perspectives.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I the words just
come out, right?
Yeah. Silo and ocean. It's not bad.